Margaret Williams had dreamed of visiting London for over 60 years. Growing up in a small farming town in Iowa, she had collected postcards of Buckingham Palace, read every book about the British royal family she could find in the local library, and watched every documentary about the Queen's Guard on her old television set. Her fascination began as a young girl when her grandfather, who had served alongside British soldiers during World War II, would tell her stories about the brave men who protected the royal family. Now at 78, Margaret finally had her chance. Her daughter Sarah had surprised her with a trip to London for her birthday, something they had been saving for since Margaret's husband passed away 3 years earlier. The journey across the Atlantic was long and tiring, but Margaret's excitement never faded. She pressed her face against the airplane window as they descended into Heathrow, watching the sprawling city come into view. Their small hotel room near Victoria Station wasn't fancy, but Margaret didn't care. She had brought her best dress, a navy blue outfit with small pearl buttons that she had worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. She had also packed her late husband's old camera, the one he had used to photograph their children growing up. Margaret wanted to capture every moment of this once-in-a-lifetime experience. The morning of their planned visit to Buckingham Palace arrived gray and drizzly, typical London weather that somehow made everything feel more authentic to Margaret. She woke up early, unable to contain her excitement, and spent extra time getting ready. Sarah watched her mother with a mixture of joy and concern, knowing how much this trip meant to her but worried about the crowds and walking involved. As they made their way through the London streets, Margaret marveled at everything around her. The red double-decker buses, the black cabs, the historic buildings she had only seen in photographs. Every step brought her closer to a dream she had nurtured since childhood. The anticipation was almost overwhelming, but in the best possible way. When they finally reached Buckingham Palace, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The massive building stood before her like something from a fairy tale, its cream-colored walls and ornate gates more impressive than any photograph could capture. Hundreds of tourists crowded around the famous black iron railings, cameras clicking constantly. But Margaret stood perfectly still for a moment, simply taking it all in. Sarah gently took her mother's arm and guided her through the crowd toward the front gates where the Queen's Guard stood at attention. Margaret had read about these soldiers countless times, but seeing them in person was entirely different. They stood motionless in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats, rifles at their sides, faces stern and expressionless beneath the fur. The crowd pressed closer, everyone trying to get the perfect photograph, but Margaret found herself struggling. At her height of barely 5 feet 2 inches, and with her walking cane making movement difficult, she couldn't get a clear view through the sea of people. Tourists pushed past her, some accidentally bumping into her as they jostled for position. Young people held their phones high above their heads, blocking her view even further. Margaret tried moving to different spots along the fence, but each time she found a small opening, someone taller would step in front of her. She didn't want to complain or ask anyone to move, having been raised to never make a fuss. Sarah noticed her mother's disappointment growing and tried to help by asking some tourists if they could let her elderly mother get a quick photo, but most people were too focused on their own pictures to pay attention. After nearly an hour of trying, Margaret's legs began to ache, and she had to lean heavily on her cane. The dream she had carried for so long seemed to be slipping away, replaced by the reality of being just another face in an endless crowd of tourists. Her eyes filled with tears that she tried to hide from Sarah, not wanting her daughter to feel bad about the expensive trip that wasn't turning out as they had hoped. Unknown to Margaret, someone had been watching her struggle. Guard Thomas Henderson had been stationed at the palace gates for 3 years and had developed an eye for different types of visitors. He could spot the rushed tourists trying to check Buckingham Palace off their list, the excited school groups on field trips, and the devoted royal watchers who came regularly. But something about the elderly American woman with the walking cane caught his attention. From his position, Thomas could see how she politely tried to navigate through the crowd, never pushing or demanding attention like so many others did. He watched her daughter trying to help, saw the disappointment growing on the older woman's face as she was repeatedly blocked from getting a clear view. During his years of service, Thomas had been trained to remain completely still and emotionless, but this situation tugged at something inside him. The guard remembered his own grandmother, who had passed away the previous year without ever getting to see him in his ceremonial uniform. She had been so proud when he joined the Queen's Guard, bragging to all her friends at the nursing home about her grandson, who protected the royal family. He had promised to bring her to see him at his post, but her health declined too quickly, and she died before they could make the trip. Margaret reminded him so much of his grandmother, the same gentle manner, the same obvious excitement mixed with determination despite physical limitations. Thomas began to notice other details about her that set her apart from typical tourists. She wasn't just snapping random photos like most visitors. Instead, she seemed to be studying everything with genuine reverence and interest, as if she were trying to memorize every detail. During a brief moment when the crowd thinned slightly, Thomas saw Margaret finally get a partial view of him and his fellow guards. Her face lit up with such pure joy that it was visible even from his distance. She raised her husband's old camera with shaking hands, but just as she was about to take the photo, another group of tourists moved directly into her line of sight. The disappointment that crossed her face in that moment made Thomas's decision for him. What happened next would be talked about for years among both the guards and regular palace visitors. Thomas did something that went against every rule of his position. Without breaking his rigid posture or changing his facial expression, he began to move. Step by careful step, he marched from his assigned post toward the crowd where Margaret stood. The tourists nearby noticed first. Whispers began to spread through the crowd as people realized one of the Queen's guards was approaching. Cameras turned toward Thomas as he continued his slow, measured march directly toward the elderly woman with the cane. Margaret didn't notice at first, still struggling to see over the heads in front of her. Sarah was the first to tap her mother's shoulder and point. Margaret looked up to see the tall guard in his brilliant red tunic walking straight toward her, his expression still serious and professional, but his intent unmistakable. The crowd began to part automatically, sensing that something unusual was happening. People stopped their chatter and lowered their cameras, watching in amazement. When Thomas reached Margaret, he came to a perfect stop directly in front of her, just 3 feet away. For a moment, the entire area fell silent, except for the distant sound of London traffic. Margaret looked up at him with wide eyes, hardly believing what was happening. Here was one of the famous Queen's Guards, someone she had admired from afar for so long, standing right in front of her. Still maintaining his rigid military bearing, Thomas then did something even more extraordinary. He slowly brought his rifle up in a formal salute, holding the position with perfect precision. The gesture was clearly meant for Margaret alone. Around them, the crowd remained silent, instinctively understanding they were witnessing something special. Margaret's hands trembled as she raised her late husband's camera, hardly able to believe this moment was real. For the first time in over an hour, she had a perfect, unobstructed view, and more than that, she had the personal attention of one of the very guards she had traveled so far to see. Margaret's hands shook so much that Sarah had to help steady the camera. Through her tears, she managed to take several photographs, each one capturing not just the image of the guard, but the magic of the moment itself. Thomas held his salute for a full 30 seconds, long enough for her to get the perfect shot, long enough for the moment to be forever etched in her memory. But the guard wasn't finished. After completing his salute, he did something that made the crowd gasp audibly. With the same careful precision, he removed his tall bearskin hat and placed it gently on Margaret's head. The enormous hat nearly covered her entire face, and she had to tilt her head back to see out from under it. The sight was both comical and deeply touching, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, Margaret broke into the biggest smile of her life. The crowd, which had been silent in respect, suddenly erupted in applause and cheers. People were laughing and crying at the same time, phones and cameras capturing every second of this unprecedented display of kindness. Other tourists began calling out encouragement and praise, some shouting "brilliant" and "how wonderful" in various languages. Even other guards at nearby posts who had to maintain their positions were clearly moved by what their colleague was doing. Sarah quickly took dozens of photos of her mother wearing the guard's hat, each one showing Margaret's pure childlike joy. For those few minutes, she wasn't a tired elderly tourist struggling with crowds and physical limitations. She was a little girl from Iowa whose biggest dream was finally coming true in the most beautiful way possible. The weight of the hat, the texture of the fur, the smell of the military wool, every detail would be remembered forever. Thomas then carefully lifted the hat from Margaret's head and placed it back on his own. He returned to attention, gave her one more formal nod of acknowledgement, and then began his measured march back to his post. The crowd parted again, still applauding, still amazed by what they had witnessed. Margaret stood there for several moments, touching her hair where the hat had been, hardly able to believe what had just happened to her. Word of Thomas's gesture spread quickly through the crowd and beyond. Other tourists who had witnessed the moment began sharing their own photos and videos on social media, and soon the story was being retold around the world. Several people approached Margaret afterward, wanting to hear her story and share in her joy. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by what they had seen. Margaret spent the rest of her London visit in a state of pure happiness that seemed to give her renewed energy. The photos from that day became her most treasured possessions, displayed prominently in her home back in Iowa. She would tell the story to anyone who would listen, her eyes lighting up every time as if it had just happened. The kindness of one young guard had transformed what could have been a disappointing tourist experience into the most meaningful moment of her later years. For Thomas, the consequences of breaking protocol could have been severe, but his superiors understood the power of what he had done. The story brought positive attention to the Queen's Guard and highlighted the humanity behind the ceremonial roles. He received letters from around the world, thanking him for his gesture and sharing similar stories of small acts of kindness that had made enormous differences in people's lives. Margaret lived for 5 more years after her trip to London, and every one of her friends and neighbors knew about her encounter with the Royal Guard. She would often say that Thomas had given her something more valuable than just a photo opportunity. He had shown her that behind the tradition and ceremony, there were real people with real hearts who could recognize when someone needed a moment of magic in their life. The photos from that day were displayed at Margaret's funeral, and Sarah made sure to send copies to the palace with a letter explaining how much the guard's kindness had meant to her mother. Thomas, who had since been promoted and moved to other duties, kept that letter in his personal files as a reminder of why small gestures of humanity matter so much, especially in a world that often seems too busy or too formal to notice when someone just needs to be seen and treated with kindness. The story continues to be shared today, proof that sometimes the most meaningful moments come not from grand gestures or expensive gifts, but from one person simply recognizing another person's heart and responding with compassion.